Imagine standing on 16 million bricks in the middle of the ocean, 70 miles from the nearest land. The year is 1865, and you're surrounded by 8-foot-thick walls that rise from crystal blue waters like a medieval castle dropped into the tropics. This is Fort Jefferson, the largest masonry fortress in the Western Hemisphere, built at a cost equivalent to $500 million today. But here's what they didn't tell you in history class. This massive prison fortress, designed to be escape-proof, never fired a single shot in battle. Instead, it became a tomb where yellow fever killed more men than any enemy ever could, where guards went as insane as their prisoners, and where one of Lincoln's assassination conspirators would save the lives of the very soldiers keeping him captive. For over 28 years, the United States government poured money and lives into this remote outpost, convinced they were building the ultimate symbol of American power. What they actually created was a monument to human hubris, a place where isolation itself became the cruelest warden, and where nature proved more deadly than any cannon. Today, we're diving deep into the classified reports, the forgotten testimonies, and the brutal reality of life inside America's most expensive failure. This is the story they tried to bury in bureaucratic files and salt air. If you're ready to uncover the truth about Fort Jefferson, stay with me, because what happened on that isolated key will change how you see American history forever. In the year 1846, the United States government made a decision that would cost the equivalent of $500 million in today's money. They would build the largest masonry fortress in the Western Hemisphere on a speck of coral sand 68 miles west of Key West, Florida. 16 million bricks would be shipped by sea to this remote outpost. Thousands of tons of granite would follow. And for what? A fortress that would never fire a single shot in anger. A prison that would become a monument to human hubris. A place where isolation itself would become both the ultimate weapon and the final executioner. This is the story of Fort Jefferson, where the promise of absolute security became an exercise in absolute futility. The year is 1845, and America is flexing its muscles across a continent. The Mexican-American War looms on the horizon. Pirates still prowl the Caribbean shipping lanes. And in Washington, military planners study their maps with growing concern. The Gulf of Mexico, they realize, is America's soft underbelly. A single hostile fleet stationed in these waters could strangle trade between New Orleans and the Atlantic ports. Something must be done. The solution, when it comes, is breathtaking in its audacity. Build a fortress so far from shore that enemy ships cannot reach it undetected, so massive that no force could reduce it, so isolated that prisoners sent there would face a choice between the mercy of their captors and the merciless embrace of the open ocean. The site chosen is Garden Key, a fragment of coral and sand barely 16 acres in size. It sits in the dry Tortugas, a cluster of 7 small islands that rise like afterthoughts from the turquoise waters of the Gulf. The nearest fresh water is 70 miles away. The nearest town, Key West, requires a journey of nearly 4 hours by steamship across open ocean. In 1845, this distance might as well be the far side of the moon. The Army Corps of Engineers, flush with confidence from recent victories over rivers and mountains, declares the project not just feasible, but inevitable. Chief Engineer Joseph Totten, a man who has never seen a challenge he couldn't reduce to mathematics, estimates the fortress will require 3 million bricks. He is off by more than 500%. The final structure will consume 16 million bricks, each one manufactured in Pensacola and shipped by schooner across 200 miles of often hostile seas. But in 1845, Such concerns seem manageable. The engineers see only opportunity where others might see impossibility. They envision a six-sided brick colossus rising 50 feet above the waves, its walls 8 feet thick, its armament consisting of 450 cannons, capable of sinking any ship foolish enough to approach within range. They call it Fort Jefferson, after the third President of the United States, though Jefferson himself, with his distrust of standing armies and massive public works, might have questioned the wisdom of the enterprise. The first ships arrive at Garden Key in December 1846, carrying not just bricks and mortar, but the dreams and delusions of a young nation drunk on its own possibilities. The workers who step onto that desolate shore have no way of knowing they are beginning a project that will outlast the Confederacy, survive 2 world wars, and ultimately serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of confusing engineering prowess with strategic wisdom. The island that will become home to Fort Jefferson is, in geological terms, barely an island at all. Garden Key rises no more than 4 feet above high tide, a fact that will prove more significant than any engineer in 1846 can possibly imagine. The key consists primarily of coral sand and broken shell, materials that seem solid enough until the first hurricane demonstrates otherwise. But the Army Corps of Engineers, accustomed to building on the solid ground of rivers and mountains, approaches this challenge with characteristic confidence. They sink wooden piles deep into the coral foundation, then begin laying course after course of brick, each layer sealed with mortar, mixed from lime and sand. The work proceeds with military precision, sunrise to sunset, 6 days a week, with only the Sabbath offering respite from the relentless rhythm of construction. The bricks themselves tell a story of logistical complexity that borders on the absurd. Each brick must be manufactured in Pensacola, loaded onto schooners designed for cargo rather than comfort, then transported across 200 miles of open water where sudden squalls can turn a routine voyage into a disaster. Weather delays are frequent, ships sink, entire loads of bricks rest now on the floor of the Gulf of Mexico, their intended fortress slowly rising without them. By 1850, the true scope of the project becomes clear even to its most optimistic supporters. The original estimate of 3 million bricks has proven laughably inadequate. The fortress now under construction will require not 3 million, but 16 million bricks. The cost, originally projected at less than $100,000, has already exceeded $400,000 and shows no sign of slowing. In today's currency, the United States government is spending the equivalent of $500 million to build a fortress on a sandbar in the middle of nowhere. Yet the work continues, driven by a momentum that seems to have acquired a life of its own. By 1855, the outer walls of Fort Jefferson rise 45 feet above the waves, their red brick faces broken by the dark rectangles of gun ports and the occasional window. From a distance, the structure appears almost medieval, a castle from some European fairy tale transplanted to the tropical waters of the Gulf. Up close, the impression is more industrial. This is not a castle built for kings and knights, but a machine built for war. The men who labor on this machine come from across America and beyond. Irish immigrants, fleeing the potato famine, mix with German craftsmen seeking opportunity in the New World. Former slaves work alongside white laborers, their legal status often ambiguous in this remote outpost where federal authority exists more in theory than in practice. The work is brutal, conducted under a tropical sun that turns the brick walls into ovens and makes the handling of metal tools an exercise in endurance. Fresh water, that most basic necessity of life, must be imported from Key West or captured from the occasional rainstorm. The cisterns built into the fortress can hold thousands of gallons, but they are never quite enough. Water discipline becomes as important as military discipline. Men learn to ration their consumption, to save every drop, to pray for rain with the fervor of desert wanderers. Disease is a constant companion. The tropical climate, combined with poor sanitation and overcrowding, creates ideal conditions for yellow fever, cholera, and dysentery. The fortress hospital, built into the lower level of the structure, fills and empties with depressing regularity. Men who arrive healthy and eager for work find themselves weakened by illness, broken by heat, or simply worn down by the psychological weight of isolation. And isolation it truly is. Letters from home take weeks to arrive, if they arrive at all. Ships bringing supplies and mail are often delayed by weather or mechanical problems. The men of Fort Jefferson exist in a bubble of time and space, cut off from the events shaping the world beyond their brick walls. They hear rumors of political tension between North and South, but these seem as distant and irrelevant as events on another planet. By 1860, Fort Jefferson is largely complete, though work continues on the interior structures and armament. The fortress now consists of 3 levels, each containing living quarters, storage rooms, and gun emplacements. The lowest level, built partially below sea level, houses the magazines, cisterns, and cells that will soon hold some of America's most infamous prisoners. The second level contains the main garrison areas and officers' quarters. The third level, open to the sky, mounts the heaviest cannons and provides commanding views of the surrounding waters. The numbers are impressive by any measure. 16 million bricks form walls 8 feet thick. 450 cannons of various calibers can deliver devastating firepower against any approaching enemy. The fortress can house 1,500 men, along with enough supplies to withstand a siege of several months. In terms of raw engineering, Fort Jefferson represents a remarkable achievement, a testament to American industrial capacity and determination. But even as the fortress nears completion, questions about its purpose become harder to ignore. The pirates who once threatened Gulf shipping have been largely eliminated by the U.S. Navy. The British, once considered the most likely enemy, show little interest in challenging American control of Gulf waters. The French, Spanish, and other European powers are dealing with their own internal problems and colonial rebellions. Most troubling of all, the fortress that was designed to dominate Gulf shipping lanes sits too far from those lanes to be effective. Ships passing between New Orleans and the Atlantic ports travel much closer to the Florida coast, well beyond the range of Fort Jefferson's guns. The fortress can certainly sink any ship that comes within range, but very few ships have any reason to come within range. This strategic irrelevance becomes even more apparent as the 1850s progress. The development of steam-powered warships makes the fortress's fixed position less advantageous. Modern naval warfare increasingly favors speed and maneuverability over static fortification. The massive guns of Fort Jefferson, impressive as they are, represent an approach to warfare that is already becoming obsolete. Yet the fortress continues to consume resources at an alarming rate. The annual cost of maintaining 1,500 men on a remote island, shipping all supplies by sea, and keeping the structure itself in good repair exceeds the entire budget of many government departments. Critics in Congress begin to question whether Fort Jefferson represents sound fiscal policy or merely an expensive monument to military stubbornness. The answer comes in 1861, when the Confederate attack on Fort Sumter finally provides Fort Jefferson with a clear purpose. The fortress becomes not just a strategic outpost, but a symbol of federal authority in a region where such authority is increasingly challenged. More importantly for the men stationed there, it becomes a military prison, housing deserters, political prisoners, and other enemies of the Union cause. The transformation from fortress to prison occurs with startling swiftness. The gun emplacements that were designed to destroy enemy ships are converted to guard posts, watching for escaping prisoners. The magazines that once stored ammunition now hold shackles and chains. The parade ground where soldiers once drilled becomes an exercise yard where prisoners walk in endless circles, their eyes fixed on the horizon and the freedom that lies forever beyond their reach. The first prisoners arrive in 1863, transported from the mainland under heavy guard. They include deserters from various Union regiments, men who found the reality of military service less appealing than the recruiting posters had suggested. There are also civilian prisoners, men whose political views or business activities have brought them to the attention of federal authorities. The charges range from treason and sedition to simple draft resistance. Among these early prisoners is a group that would have seemed unimaginable just a few years earlier: captured Confederate soldiers. These men, many of them veterans of Antietam and Gettysburg, find themselves imprisoned not by a foreign enemy, but by their own countrymen. They are housed in the same cells, eat the same food, and follow the same routine as common deserters and criminals. The irony is not lost on anyone. The daily routine at Fort Jefferson settles into a pattern that will remain largely unchanged for the duration of its service as a prison. Reveille sounds at dawn, followed by roll call and the distribution of water rations. Prisoners are assigned to work details that include construction, maintenance, cooking, and cleaning. The labor is hard and the hours long, but it provides a welcome distraction from the psychological weight of confinement. The fortress itself, designed for military efficiency rather than human comfort, proves surprisingly well suited to its new role as a prison. The thick brick walls that were meant to stop cannonballs also prevent escape attempts. The narrow windows and corridors limit movement and make surveillance easier. The isolation that was meant to protect the fortress from enemy attack now serves to discourage prisoners from attempting to flee. But it is this same isolation that begins to extract its own terrible price, not just on the prisoners, but on their guards as well. The guards at Fort Jefferson face a peculiar form of imprisonment themselves, one that becomes more apparent with each passing month. Unlike their prisoners, they have committed no crime, yet they too are trapped on this speck of coral and brick, surrounded by endless miles of water that might as well be an ocean of molten lead for all the freedom it offers. Sergeant Michael O'Brien of the 3rd Artillery arrives at Fort Jefferson in January 1863, expecting a routine assignment at what he imagines will be a busy coastal fortress. Instead, he finds himself supervising men whose only crime was refusing to die for a cause they no longer believed in, or whose political opinions ran counter to the prevailing winds in Washington. The irony cuts deep. O'Brien himself harbors serious doubts about the war, doubts that grow stronger. Each day he spends watching broken men shuffle around the fortress courtyard. The psychological architecture of Fort Jefferson proves as confining as its physical structure. The fortress measures only 500 feet across at its widest point, yet it houses nearly 800 men during peak occupancy. Privacy becomes a forgotten luxury. Every conversation can be overheard, every movement observed, every emotion dissected by bored minds with nothing better to do than analyze their fellow inmates. Guards and prisoners alike develop a 1,000-yard stare, the look of men who have learned to focus on distant horizons because the immediate surroundings have become unbearable. Water remains the fortress's most precious commodity, more valuable than gold or ammunition. The massive cisterns built into the lower level can hold 48,000 gallons when full, but they are seldom full for long. A man needs at least a gallon per day to survive in the tropical heat, more if he is performing physical labor. With 800 mouths to water and no reliable source of fresh water within 70 miles, every drop must be carefully rationed and religiously conserved. The arrival of the supply ship becomes the most important event in the fortress calendar, more eagerly anticipated than Christmas or the 4th of July. The men gather at the walls to watch the distant speck grow larger on the horizon, counting the minutes until the ship anchors in the shallow waters off Garden Key. Sometimes the ship brings letters from home, packages from family, newspapers that are weeks old but still precious for their connection to the outside world. More often, it brings only supplies: food, fresh water, ammunition, and the occasional replacement for a guard who has completed his tour of duty or succumbed to disease. Disease stalks the fortress with the patience of a professional hunter. The tropical climate, combined with poor ventilation and overcrowding, creates perfect conditions for epidemic illness. Yellow fever is the most feared killer, striking without warning and claiming victims within days. But cholera, dysentery, and typhoid fever also take their toll, along with a dozen lesser ailments that weaken men's bodies and break their spirits. Dr. Samuel Mudd arrives at Fort Jefferson on July 25, 1865, and his presence transforms the fortress from a merely remote prison into a place of genuine historical significance. Mudd, a physician from Maryland, has been convicted of conspiracy in the assassination of President Lincoln for setting the broken leg of John Wilkes Booth during the assassin's flight from Washington. Whether Mudd knew of Booth's crime when he provided medical treatment remains a matter of heated debate, but the military tribunal that convicted him was not interested in such fine distinctions. Mudd's arrival creates a sensation among both guards and prisoners. Here is a man whose name appears in newspapers across the nation, whose fate has been debated in the halls of Congress and the salons of Washington society. Yet in the suffocating confines of Fort Jefferson, he is simply prisoner number 227, subject to the same rules, the same rations, and the same daily humiliations as every other man behind these brick walls. The doctor adapts to prison life with surprising grace, perhaps because his medical training has prepared him for the sight of human suffering. He tends to sick prisoners when the fortress surgeon is overwhelmed or absent, earning a grudging respect from men who might otherwise view him as a political pariah. Mudd's presence also attracts attention from the outside world, bringing occasional visitors and keeping Fort Jefferson in the national consciousness during a period when the fortress might otherwise have been forgotten. But Mudd's case also illustrates the fundamental problem with using Fort Jefferson as a political prison. The fortress's isolation, which makes escape virtually impossible, also makes it difficult for the government to demonstrate its mercy or respond to changing political circumstances. Men who might have been released or pardoned if they were imprisoned closer to Washington find themselves forgotten in this tropical exile, their cases gathering dust while they waste away under the Florida sun. The daily routine at Fort Jefferson follows a pattern as rigid as the fortress walls themselves. Reveille sounds at 5:30 in the morning, followed immediately by roll call. Prisoners and guards alike stumble from their bunks, most still groggy from the oppressive heat that makes sleep difficult even during the supposedly cooler nighttime hours. The first order of business is the distribution of water rations, a ceremony conducted with the solemnity of a religious ritual. Breakfast consists of hardtack, salt pork, and coffee so weak it barely deserves the name. The food is prepared in massive quantities in the fortress kitchen, then distributed to smaller groups who eat in shifts. Fresh vegetables are a rare luxury, available only when supply ships arrive from Key West, or when the fortress garden produces its meager harvest of tomatoes and peppers. Scurvy becomes a constant threat, combated with occasional distributions of lime juice that give the men's daily routine a faintly nautical flavor. Work details begin at 7 in the morning and continue until 5 in the evening, with a 2-hour break during the hottest part of the day. Prisoners are assigned to various tasks based on their skills and the fortress's needs. Some work in the kitchen, others in the hospital or the workshops where uniforms are mended and equipment repaired. The strongest are assigned to construction and maintenance details, hauling bricks and mortar to repair walls damaged by constant exposure to salt air and tropical storms. The most dreaded assignment is the punishment detail, reserved for prisoners who have violated fortress regulations or shown signs of rebellious behavior. These men spend their days breaking coral with sledgehammers, hauling buckets of sand from one location to another, or scrubbing walls that will be dirty again within hours. The work serves no practical purpose beyond breaking the spirit of men who still harbor thoughts of resistance. Lieutenant Colonel George Andrews, the fortress commander, rules Fort Jefferson with the rigid discipline of a man who understands that his authority depends entirely on the perception of absolute control. Andrews, a career military officer with 30 years of service, has commanded frontier posts from Dakota Territory to the Arizona desert, but he has never faced a challenge quite like Fort Jefferson. Here, he must maintain discipline among men who have little left to lose, while simultaneously managing the complex logistics of keeping hundreds of people alive on a remote island with no natural resources. Andrews maintains detailed records of every aspect of fortress life, from the daily water consumption to the number of bricks used in wall repairs. His correspondence with Washington reveals a man increasingly frustrated by the gap between military theory and the reality of governing an isolated prison. The rule books that work perfectly well in conventional military settings prove inadequate when applied to a situation where guards and prisoners share the same water rations and face the same threats from disease and isolation. The fortress regulations, posted in prominent locations throughout the structure, run to 47 pages of small print covering everything from the proper method of saluting officers to the punishment for attempting escape. But many of the most important rules governing life at Fort Jefferson are unwritten, understood through experience rather than formal instruction. Guards learn not to get too close to the walls during storms, when flying debris can kill a man instantly. Prisoners learn which guards can be trusted with small favors and which ones will report the slightest infraction to the commanding officer. Everyone learns to respect the water. Wasting water, whether through carelessness or malicious intent, is one of the few offenses that can unite guards and prisoners in outrage. A man who leaves a faucet running or deliberately spills his ration may find himself facing unofficial punishment far more severe than anything prescribed in the regulations. The fortress's survival depends on the careful conservation of every precious drop, and violations of this sacred trust are not tolerated. The fortress library consists of fewer than 200 books, most of them military manuals, religious texts, and outdated novels donated by charitable organizations in Key West. The books are read until their pages fall apart, then carefully repaired with whatever materials are available. Men who have never shown interest in literature find themselves memorizing entire chapters of books they despise, simply because reading provides a temporary escape from the crushing reality of their confinement. Letters from home are scrutinized by censors before being distributed to their recipients, but the censorship process often takes weeks, and many letters arrive so heavily redacted that their meaning becomes incomprehensible. Still, the arrival of mail brings a brief surge of hope to the fortress, even for men who receive nothing. The possibility that someone, somewhere, still remembers their existence provides a psychological lifeline that keeps many prisoners from complete despair. The fortress chapel, built into a converted gun emplacement on the second level, holds services every Sunday morning for those willing to attend. The chaplain, when present, is usually a military officer with minimal theological training, but his sermons provide one of the few opportunities for men to gather in large groups without the explicit purpose of work or discipline. The hymns, sung without instrumental accompaniment, echo strangely through the brick corridors, their familiar melodies made haunting by the alien environment in which they are performed. Christmas at Fort Jefferson is observed with whatever meager celebration the circumstances allow. Guards and prisoners receive slightly larger rations, and work details are suspended for the day. If a supply ship has arrived recently, there might be small gifts from charitable organizations, tobacco, candy, or writing materials. But the holiday also intensifies the psychological weight of separation from family and familiar surroundings. More than one prisoner has attempted escape on Christmas Day, preferring the almost certain death that awaits in the open ocean to another year of confinement behind these brick walls. The fortress maintains its own small cemetery on Garden Key, though the graves contain fewer bodies than one might expect. The army prefers to ship deceased soldiers back to the mainland when possible, both for morale reasons and because the coral soil makes burial difficult. The graves that do exist mark the resting places of men who died during epidemic outbreaks when transportation was impossible, or whose families lacked the resources to pay for the return of their bodies. But it is the living who present the greatest challenge to Fort Jefferson's commanders. As the Civil War drags on and the fortress's strategic irrelevance becomes undeniable, maintaining discipline among both guards and prisoners requires increasingly creative approaches. The traditional military punishments lose their effectiveness when applied to men who already consider themselves beyond hope or redemption. Solitary confinement means little to men who are already isolated from the world. Extra duty is meaningless when every day brings 16 hours of labor under a brutal sun. Some prisoners retreat into madness, developing elaborate fantasies about rescue or revenge. Others become model inmates, hoping that good behavior will eventually earn them a transfer to a mainland prison closer to home. A few attempt escape, though the ocean surrounding Fort Jefferson makes such attempts more symbolic than practical. The most successful escape attempt in the fortress's history ends with the recapture of the fugitives on a small island 12 miles away, where they are found nearly dead from thirst and exposure. The guards fare somewhat better than their prisoners, at least in theory. They receive better food, larger water rations, and the possibility of rotation to other assignments after completing their tour of duty. But many guards find themselves as psychologically damaged by their service at Fort Jefferson as the men they are paid to watch. The constant vigilance required to maintain security, combined with the isolation and tropical diseases, takes a severe toll on mental health and military efficiency. By late 1865, it becomes clear that Fort Jefferson is consuming far more resources than it can possibly be worth to the federal government. The fortress requires constant shipments of food, water, ammunition, and medical supplies from the mainland. The transportation costs alone exceed the annual salary of a cabinet secretary. Meanwhile, the strategic value of the fortress continues to decline as the nature of naval warfare evolves and America's attention turns to reconstruction and westward expansion. Yet the fortress continues to operate, sustained by institutional momentum and the difficulty of admitting that such a massive investment has been a mistake from the beginning. The year 1867 brings to Fort Jefferson a crisis that will forever change its character and purpose. In August, yellow fever arrives on the supply ship Thomas A. Scott, carried in the blood of sailors who show no symptoms until they have already infected half the fortress. The disease spreads with terrifying speed through the overcrowded quarters, claiming victims without regard for rank, guilt, or innocence. Dr. Samuel Mudd, the imprisoned physician whose medical expertise has been largely ignored by the military authorities, suddenly finds himself the most valuable man at Fort Jefferson. The fortress surgeon, Dr. Daniel Whitehurst, falls ill on the third day of the outbreak and dies within a week. His assistant succumbs 2 days later. The remaining medical personnel, untrained enlisted men with basic first aid knowledge, prove utterly inadequate to the scale of the catastrophe unfolding within the brick walls. The fortress commander, Lieutenant Colonel Andrews, faces an impossible choice. Military regulations strictly forbid allowing prisoners to assume positions of authority or responsibility. But with the medical staff dead or dying, and the disease spreading through the fortress like wildfire, Andrews must choose between military protocol and the survival of his command. On August 15, 1867, he makes the decision that will ultimately save hundreds of lives and change the course of American justice. Dr. Mudd is released from his cell and given complete authority over the fortress medical facilities. Working 20-hour days with virtually no assistance, he moves through the sick wards like a man possessed, treating guards and prisoners with equal dedication. His knowledge of tropical diseases, gained through his medical practice in Maryland's humid climate, proves invaluable in understanding how yellow fever spreads and how its symptoms can be managed. The doctor establishes strict quarantine procedures, isolating the sick from the healthy and organizing work details to maintain sanitation in the face of overwhelming illness. He requisitions clean water for washing and insists on proper disposal of waste, measures that seem obvious in retrospect but require enormous effort to implement in a fortress where every resource is precious and every routine is governed by military necessity. The death toll mounts steadily through September. Guards who were healthy men in the morning are found dead in their bunks by evening. Prisoners who reported for work detail at dawn are carried to the hospital before noon. The fortress's small cemetery expands daily, though many bodies are simply weighted with chains and buried at sea when the death rate overwhelms the capacity for proper burial on Garden Key. Dr. Mudd's heroism during the epidemic becomes legendary among both guards and prisoners. Men who previously viewed him as a traitor and assassin's accomplice begin to see him as their savior. His tireless efforts to treat the sick, regardless of their status or previous opinions of his guilt or innocence, demonstrate a level of medical and moral commitment that transcends the political divisions that brought him to Fort Jefferson in the first place. The crisis reaches its peak in late September, when nearly half the fortress population lies sick or dying. Normal military routines become impossible to maintain. Guard posts are abandoned when their occupants collapse from fever. Work details cease when too few healthy men remain to supervise the prisoners. For several terrifying days, Fort Jefferson exists in a state of de facto anarchy, governed only by the shared struggle against disease and death. But Dr. Mudd's interventions begin to show results. The quarantine procedures slow the spread of infection. His careful attention to sanitation reduces the secondary infections that often prove more deadly than yellow fever itself. Most importantly, his presence provides a psychological anchor for men who might otherwise have given up hope entirely. If the doctor could continue working despite his own imprisonment and the hatred directed toward him, perhaps they too could find the strength to endure. The epidemic finally breaks in early October, leaving Fort Jefferson a changed place. Of the 800 men who had been housed in the fortress when the outbreak began, fewer than 500 remain alive. The dead include guards and prisoners, officers and enlisted men, criminals and political prisoners. Yellow fever, like the isolation that defines life at Fort Jefferson, recognizes no distinction between the innocent and the guilty. Lieutenant Colonel Andrews, who survived the epidemic through what he privately considers divine intervention, submits a detailed report to Washington praising Dr. Mudd's efforts and recommending executive clemency. The recommendation works its way through the military bureaucracy with unusual speed, perhaps because officials in Washington are eager to find some positive outcome from the disaster at Fort Jefferson. President Andrew Johnson, himself fighting impeachment proceedings and desperately seeking opportunities to demonstrate presidential mercy, seizes upon Dr. Mudd's case as an opportunity to show both magnanimity and sound judgment. On February 8, 1869, Johnson issues a presidential pardon to Dr. Mudd, along with 2 other Lincoln assassination conspirators imprisoned at Fort Jefferson. The doctor's heroism during the yellow fever epidemic has transformed him from a symbol of treachery into an example of redemption through service. Dr. Mudd's departure from Fort Jefferson in March 1869 marks the beginning of the end for the fortress as a military prison. The yellow fever epidemic has demonstrated the impossibility of maintaining a large population on Garden Key without accepting unacceptable risks from disease and supply line failures. More importantly, the political landscape that made Fort Jefferson seem necessary has changed dramatically since the end of the Civil War. The fortress that was built to dominate Gulf shipping lanes during an era of sail-powered commerce now faces a world increasingly governed by steam power and global trade routes. The pirates and foreign enemies that once threatened American interests in the Gulf have been replaced by more complex challenges that cannot be solved with brick walls and cannon. The political prisoners whose confinement at Fort Jefferson was meant to demonstrate federal resolve are now more valuable as symbols of national reconciliation than as examples of government punishment. Yet the physical structure of Fort Jefferson continues to demand enormous resources for its maintenance. The tropical climate that makes life miserable for its human inhabitants proves equally destructive to brick, mortar, and iron. Salt air corrodes metal with relentless efficiency. Storms batter the walls with waves that find every weakness in the masonry. The coral foundation, never entirely stable, shifts and settles under the enormous weight of 16 million bricks, creating cracks that must be constantly monitored and repaired. The fortress's fresh water system, always its most critical weakness, requires increasingly expensive maintenance as the original cisterns develop leaks and the pumping equipment corrodes in the salt air. Estimates suggest that simply maintaining the current water capacity will require replacing the entire system within 5 years at a cost exceeding the fortress's original construction budget. Meanwhile, the capacity itself remains inadequate for the population the fortress was designed to house. Colonel Daniel Houston, who assumes command of Fort Jefferson in 1870, submits regular reports to Washington detailing the mounting costs of maintaining what he increasingly views as a white elephant. His correspondence reveals a man caught between his military duty to maintain an assigned post and his practical understanding that the post serves no useful purpose. Houston's reports catalogue a litany of maintenance emergencies that consume ever larger portions of the military budget while contributing nothing to national defense. The fortress kitchen requires complete renovation after 3 years of tropical humidity destroy the wood stoves and brick ovens. The hospital needs new equipment to replace instruments rusted beyond repair. The guard towers require structural reinforcement after hurricanes damage their foundations. Even the fortress library suffers when moisture destroys half the book collection, leaving the remaining volumes moldy and barely readable. But the greatest threat to Fort Jefferson comes not from natural forces, but from changing political priorities in Washington. The Reconstruction era brings new demands on federal resources, from rebuilding the South to protecting freed slaves to managing the ongoing Indian wars in the West. Every dollar spent maintaining an obsolete fortress on a remote island is a dollar unavailable for more pressing national needs. Congress begins asking pointed questions about Fort Jefferson's continued operation during budget hearings in 1871. Representatives from western states, eager to secure funding for cavalry units fighting Indian wars, question the wisdom of maintaining hundreds of soldiers on a tropical island where they serve no apparent military purpose. Southern Democrats, gradually regaining political influence as Reconstruction policies moderate, argue that the fortress represents exactly the kind of federal overreach that led to sectional conflict in the first place. The Army's response to these criticisms reveals the institutional difficulty of admitting error. Military officials argue that Fort Jefferson serves important strategic purposes, though they struggle to articulate exactly what those purposes might be in the post-Civil War environment. They point to the fortress's role in suppressing piracy, though piracy has largely disappeared from Gulf waters. They emphasize its value as a coaling station for naval vessels, though few naval vessels require coal in the remote waters around the dry Tortugas. More honestly, military officials acknowledge that Fort Jefferson's primary value lies in its existence as a deterrent to potential enemies who might consider challenging American control of Gulf waters. The fortress demonstrates American resolve and engineering capability, even if it never fires a shot in anger. This argument proves increasingly difficult to sustain as the costs mount and the strategic environment continues to evolve in directions that make fixed fortifications irrelevant. The garrison at Fort Jefferson dwindles steadily through the early 1870s as soldiers complete their tours of duty and are not replaced. The fortress that once housed 800 men struggles to maintain a population of 200. Guard posts are consolidated or abandoned entirely. Work details become smaller and less frequent. The enormous structure begins to feel less like a military installation and more like a monument to abandoned ambition. The remaining soldiers adapt to their shrinking numbers with the resourcefulness that has always characterized military life. They learn to perform multiple duties as specialists in various fields, complete their service, and transfer elsewhere. Cooks become carpenters, clerks become guards, and everyone becomes a part-time maintenance worker responsible for preventing the fortress from literally falling apart around them. But even this skeleton crew cannot halt the inexorable process of decay that affects everything at Fort Jefferson. The salt air that corrodes metal and mortar also affects human motivation and morale. Men who might have taken pride in maintaining a vital military installation find it difficult to summon enthusiasm for preserving what increasingly resembles a very expensive archaeological site. The fortress that was built to last forever shows disturbing signs of mortality. Cracks appear in walls that were supposed to be impregnable. Rust eats through iron bars that were meant to confine the most dangerous criminals. The parade ground where soldiers once drilled in perfect formation becomes overgrown with weeds and scattered with debris from deteriorating buildings. Most ominously, the fortress begins to sink. The coral foundation, never entirely stable under the enormous weight of 16 million bricks, shifts and settles in ways that create structural problems throughout the complex. Doors no longer fit their frames properly. Windows stick or refuse to open. Floor tiles crack and separate as the underlying structure moves in response to forces that no 19th century engineer fully understood. The end, when it comes, arrives not with dramatic pronouncements or formal ceremonies, but with the quiet, bureaucratic language of cost-cutting and administrative efficiency. On January 15, 1874, the War Department issues General Order 19, directing the abandonment of Fort Jefferson as an active military installation. The order cites budgetary constraints, changing strategic priorities, and the impracticality of maintaining a large garrison in such a remote location. The final garrison of Fort Jefferson consists of 57 soldiers and 12 civilian employees, most of whom greet the abandonment order with relief rather than regret. These men have served faithfully in one of the most challenging assignments in the American military, maintaining discipline and completing their duties despite isolation, disease, and the growing awareness that their sacrifice serves no meaningful purpose. The process of abandoning Fort Jefferson requires nearly as much planning as its original construction. Military equipment must be removed or destroyed to prevent it from falling into unauthorized hands. Personal belongings must be packed and shipped. Records must be organized and transferred to appropriate archives. The fortress that took 28 years to build requires 6 months to close properly. But the most difficult challenge involves the fortress itself. 16 million bricks cannot simply be left to the elements without some consideration of their ultimate fate. Military regulations require that abandoned installations be rendered unusable to potential enemies, but Fort Jefferson's remote location makes enemy occupation unlikely. More practically, the massive structure represents a significant investment in government resources that might yet prove valuable for other purposes. The solution, when it emerges, reflects the same kind of bureaucratic compromise that has characterized Fort Jefferson from its inception. The fortress will be partially demolished to remove military equipment and sensitive materials, but the basic structure will remain intact under the nominal control of a civilian caretaker. This approach saves the government the enormous expense of complete demolition while avoiding the political embarrassment of admitting that the entire project was a mistake from the beginning. On May 15, 1874, the last military transport departs Garden Key, carrying away the final garrison of Fort Jefferson. The men aboard that ship look back at the massive brick walls rising from the turquoise waters and wonder what history will make of their service in this remote outpost. Few of them imagine that their abandoned fortress will become, in the next century, one of America's most visited national parks and a powerful symbol of the hubris that can accompany even the most well-intentioned government projects. The fortress they leave behind stands empty beneath the Florida sun, its courtyards echoing with the memory of 800 voices, its walls scarred by decades of tropical storms, its purpose fulfilled in ways its builders never intended and could never have imagined. The abandoned fortress does not remain empty for long. Nature, patient and relentless, begins its own occupation of Fort Jefferson within days of the military's departure. Salt air continues its corrosive work on iron and mortar. Tropical storms, no longer held at bay by constant human maintenance, find new weaknesses in walls that were built to withstand cannon fire, but prove surprisingly vulnerable to wind and rain. The fortress that was designed to dominate its environment now finds itself increasingly dominated by forces its builders never considered. The civilian caretaker, Assigned to maintain Fort Jefferson is James Johnson, a former Army sergeant, who accepts the position partly from loyalty to the service, and partly because few other employment opportunities exist for a man with his particular skills. Johnson's responsibilities, as outlined in his contract with the War Department, include preventing unauthorized access to the fortress, maintaining basic structural integrity, and filing monthly reports on the condition of government property. Johnson quickly discovers that maintaining basic structural integrity at Fort Jefferson requires the resources of a small army, not the efforts of a single man. The fortress spans 16 acres and contains more than 400 rooms, each requiring individual attention to prevent accelerated decay. The roof alone covers nearly 6 acres and develops new leaks after every significant storm. Johnson's monthly reports to Washington become increasingly desperate as he catalogues maintenance emergencies that exceed both his capabilities and his modest budget. The isolation that made Fort Jefferson useful as a prison now works against its preservation. Replacement parts for broken equipment must be ordered from Key West or farther, then transported across 70 miles of open water that can become impassable for weeks during severe weather. A broken window that might be repaired in hours at a mainland installation requires days or weeks at Fort Jefferson, during which time tropical humidity and salt air inflict additional damage on the interior. Johnson's most serious challenge involves the fortress's water system. The cisterns that once supplied 800 men with drinking water were designed with the assumption of constant maintenance and regular cleaning. Without a large workforce to perform these tasks, the cisterns become breeding grounds for mosquitoes, bacteria, and algae that render the stored water undrinkable. Johnson finds himself dependent on irregular supply ships for fresh water, a situation that becomes genuinely dangerous when storms delay deliveries for extended periods. The fortress's remoteness, which once provided security, now creates new vulnerabilities. Pirates may have disappeared from Gulf waters, but smugglers and treasure hunters view the abandoned fortress as an attractive target. Johnson's authority to prevent unauthorized access depends entirely on his ability to communicate with law enforcement officials who are hours or days away by boat. Several times during his tenure as caretaker, he awakens to find unauthorized visitors exploring the fortress, searching for valuable military equipment or simply satisfying their curiosity about this massive abandoned structure. The most persistent unauthorized visitors are wreckers and salvagers who view Fort Jefferson's 16 million bricks as a valuable source of construction material. Brick manufacturing remains expensive in the sparsely populated Florida Keys, while Fort Jefferson contains enough high-quality brick to build a small city. Johnson's reports to Washington describe increasingly bold attempts to remove bricks from the fortress walls, attempts that he lacks the authority and resources to prevent effectively. The federal government's response to these reports reveals the bureaucratic confusion that often accompanies the management of unusual properties. The War Department considers Fort Jefferson a military installation and insists that any decisions about its future use must reflect military priorities. The Treasury Department views the fortress as government property that should be managed for maximum financial return. The Interior Department suggests that the structure might have value as a lighthouse or weather station. None of these agencies wants to accept responsibility for the enormous costs of proper maintenance. This bureaucratic paralysis allows the deterioration of Fort Jefferson to accelerate throughout the late 1870s. James Johnson's monthly reports document a steady progression of structural failures that would be expensive to repair under the best circumstances and become catastrophically expensive when delayed. Window frames rot and fall from their openings. Roof tiles crack and allow water to penetrate the interior. Floor joists warp and separate, creating dangerous gaps in what were once solid surfaces. The fortress's iron fixtures suffer particularly severe damage from the salt air. The massive guns that once dominated the harbour approach rust into immobility, their barrels pitted and their carriages collapsed. Iron doors throughout the fortress freeze in position or fall from their hinges entirely. The elaborate mechanical systems that once operated drawbridges and gun elevators corrode into uselessness, leaving behind twisted metal sculptures that bear little resemblance to their original engineering elegance. But the most troubling damage occurs to the fortress's foundation. The coral bedrock that seemed adequate to support Fort Jefferson during construction proves increasingly unstable under the long-term stress of 16 million bricks. The foundation shifts and settles unevenly, creating structural stresses that manifest as cracks in walls and distortions in door frames. Johnson's reports describe doors that no longer close properly, and windows that have shifted so far from their original positions that they cannot be opened. Wildlife discovers Fort Jefferson with enthusiasm that matches the military's original excitement about the site. Seabirds establish nesting colonies in the abandoned gun emplacements, their droppings accelerating the corrosion of metal fixtures and creating sanitation problems that Johnson cannot possibly address single-handedly. Sea turtles use the fortress's beaches as nesting grounds, apparently undisturbed by the massive brick structure rising from their traditional habitat. The fortress's courtyards and corridors become home to various reptiles and small mammals that find shelter in the abandoned rooms. Johnson learns to coexist with these new residents, though he reports occasional encounters with snakes and other potentially dangerous species that have discovered the fortress offers protection from both predators and weather. The building that once housed humanity's most elaborate security system becomes a refuge for creatures that humans consider security threats. Marine life also takes advantage of Fort Jefferson's abandonment. The fortress's massive foundation creates artificial reef conditions that attract fish, crustaceans, and coral growth. The waters around Garden Key become increasingly productive for fishing, though Johnson lacks both the equipment and the authority to take advantage of this opportunity. His monthly reports describe schools of fish so large they darken the water around the fortress, a natural abundance that contrasts sharply with the human abandonment of this artificial environment. During the 1880s, several attempts are made to find profitable uses for the abandoned fortress. Entrepreneurs propose converting Fort Jefferson into a luxury resort, arguing that its isolation would appeal to wealthy tourists seeking exotic vacation experiences. Engineers suggest using the fortress as a base for experimental projects in tropical agriculture or marine research. Military contractors offer to purchase the structure for conversion into a private prison that could house inmates from overcrowded mainland facilities. None of these proposals proves financially viable when confronted with the realities of Fort Jefferson's location and condition. The remoteness that makes the fortress interesting to potential investors also makes it prohibitively expensive to supply and maintain. The structural damage that has accumulated during years of minimal maintenance would require massive investment to correct. Most importantly, the fortress's design reflects military priorities that translate poorly to civilian purposes. The federal government's reluctance to commit resources to Fort Jefferson's restoration or demolition reflects broader changes in American priorities during the late 19th century. The nation's attention has turned westward toward opportunities in mining, ranching, and railroad construction that offer more immediate returns on investment than preserving an obsolete fortress in the Gulf of Mexico. Politicians find it difficult to justify spending taxpayer money on maintenance projects that benefit primarily seabirds and marine life. James Johnson's tenure as caretaker ends in 1888, when the War Department concludes that even minimal maintenance of Fort Jefferson costs more than the property is worth. Johnson's final report to Washington catalogues structural damage so extensive that safe occupation of the fortress would require virtual reconstruction. He estimates that proper restoration would cost several times the original construction budget, an expense that no government agency is prepared to justify. The departure of the last official caretaker marks Fort Jefferson's complete abandonment to natural forces that prove more patient and ultimately more powerful than the human ambitions that created the fortress. Tropical storms, unimpeded by human maintenance, find new weaknesses in the massive walls and exploit them with the persistence of water finding its way downhill. The process of decay accelerates as each season of neglect creates vulnerabilities that the following season exploits more thoroughly. The fortress's abandonment coincides with broader changes in military technology that make its original purpose seem not merely obsolete, but almost quaint. The development of long-range naval artillery, submarine warfare, and military aviation creates strategic challenges that cannot be addressed by fixed fortifications, regardless of their size or sophistication. The Spanish-American War, fought primarily in Cuban and Philippine waters, demonstrates that modern naval conflicts require mobility and flexibility, rather than the static defense represented by Fort Jefferson. By 1900, Fort Jefferson has become a curiosity rather than a strategic asset, visited occasionally by treasure hunters, naturalists, and tourists with strong stomachs and adventurous spirits. These visitors describe a structure that still impresses through its sheer scale, but clearly bears the marks of human abandonment and natural reclamation. The fortress that once symbolized American military engineering now serves as an unintended monument to the limits of human ambition when confronted with economic reality and environmental persistence. The brick walls that were built to last forever show increasing signs of mortality. Mortar joints crack and crumble, allowing individual bricks to fall from walls and creating dangerous conditions for anyone brave enough to explore the interior. The iron reinforcements that were meant to strengthen the masonry rust and expand, creating additional stress that accelerates the breakdown of the surrounding brick. Sections of wall that appeared solid during the fortress's active years develop alarming bulges and lean at angles that suggest imminent collapse. Yet the fortress refuses to die quickly or quietly. Its massive foundation, whatever its flaws, provides enough stability to prevent dramatic collapse. The structure settles and shifts, cracks and deteriorates, but maintains enough integrity to shelter the wildlife that has claimed it as habitat. Fort Jefferson enters the 20th century as a ruin, but a ruin of such magnificent scale that it continues to command respect from anyone who encounters it. The fortress that was designed to dominate Gulf shipping lanes becomes instead a landmark for the few vessels that pass through these remote waters. Fishermen use its distinctive silhouette as a navigation aid. Sailors note its position in their logs, and occasional cruise ships include it as an exotic destination for passengers seeking unusual experiences. These visitors often comment on the surreal quality of encountering such a massive human construction in such an isolated natural setting. Scientists begin to show interest in Fort Jefferson during the early 1900s, not as a military installation, but as an artificial reef that has created unique marine habitat. Marine biologists document the coral growth that has attached itself to the fortress's underwater foundation. Ornithologists study the seabird colonies that nest in the abandoned gun emplacements. Botanists catalogue the plant species that have colonized the fortress's courtyards and rooftop areas. This scientific attention helps transform public perception of Fort Jefferson from a military failure into an ecological success. The fortress that could never fulfill its original purpose as an instrument of warfare has become, through abandonment and neglect, a sanctuary for wildlife that might otherwise have no suitable habitat in this remote corner of the Gulf of Mexico. The 16 million bricks that were meant to intimidate human enemies now provide nesting sites for birds and attachment points for coral growth. The transformation of Fort Jefferson from military installation to wildlife refuge occurs without any conscious human planning or intervention. Nature simply claims what humans have abandoned, adapting the fortress's structures to purposes its builders never imagined. Gun emplacements become nesting boxes. Water cisterns become nurseries for fish and crustaceans. Parade grounds become meadows where seagrass and wildflowers grow in soil created by decades of accumulated bird droppings and decomposing vegetation. By 1910, visitors to Fort Jefferson report that the fortress has achieved a kind of equilibrium between human artifact and natural environment. The structure continues to deteriorate, but slowly enough that its essential character remains intact. Wildlife populations have stabilized at levels that the fortress's modified environment can sustain. The building that was designed to impose human will upon a hostile environment has instead become a testament to nature's ability to adapt human creations to natural purposes. This equilibrium will not last forever. The forces that created Fort Jefferson, human ambition, engineering confidence, and political determination, have been replaced by other forces: salt air, tropical storms, and the patient work of plants and animals that recognize no difference between natural and artificial environments. The fortress will continue to provide habitat for wildlife and fascination for human visitors, but its ultimate fate remains surrender to the same forces that have claimed every human creation in this challenging environment. The story of Fort Jefferson's decline and abandonment serves as a meditation on the relationship between human ambition and natural reality. The fortress that was meant to last forever has discovered its own mortality, but in the process has become something its builders never intended, a monument not to human dominance over nature, but to nature's ultimate dominance over even the most ambitious human projects.